Ticket now. Officer Vance Mercer's voice sliced through the first-class lounge like a blade seeking prey. To him, her tailored suit wasn't professional attire. It was an offense, her presence a contradiction he couldn't process. "How exactly did someone like you end up in this section?" he asked, eyes narrowing with practiced suspicion. "My credentials aren't your concern," she replied, voice steady as polished marble. "People like you always have an attitude problem," he sneered, hand already moving to his belt. Without warning, he seized her wrist, metal cuffs appearing with practiced speed. Phones emerged, whispers rippled, eyes averted. Their mistake. He thought he was asserting dominance. Instead, he was digging his own professional grave. Because she wasn't just any passenger, she was Chief Justice Imani Washington of the United States Court of Appeals. Now she sat in custody, no rage displayed, just calm certainty, like gravity before an avalanche. What happens when airport security realizes who they've detained? How will Officer Mercer react when he discovers whose rights he's violated? Will his desperate pleas matter when federal agents arrive? And what price will he and the woman who initiated this ultimately pay? O'Hare International Airport pulsed with its usual Friday afternoon rhythm, a synchronized chaos of announcements, rolling luggage, hurried footsteps, and intermingling languages. The air carried a blend of coffee, perfume, and recycled ventilation that had become the universal scent of modern travel. At gate C-37, where Transcontinental Flight 842 prepared for boarding to Washington, D.C., passengers formed their customary lines, faces illuminated by phone screens or buried in books, everyone united in the particular impatience of those about to be airborne. Chief Justice Imani Washington stood in the priority boarding lane, her posture relaxed but dignified. At 53, she carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone accustomed to being heard without raising her voice. Her charcoal pantsuit was impeccably tailored, her low heels practical for travel, her only adornment a pair of modest pearl earrings and a vintage watch that had been her grandmother's. A federal judge herself in an era when that was nearly impossible. Washington's carry-on was positioned neatly beside her as she reviewed briefing documents on her tablet, mentally preparing for the judicial conference she would be chairing the following morning. She traveled without entourage by choice, a personal preference that allowed her to move through the world observing it as it truly was, not as it performed for judicial royalty. This practice had informed her landmark opinions on civil rights and police procedure, though today it would expose her to a more personal confrontation with the system she helped oversee. Several spaces behind her in the same priority lane stood Dolores Whitfield, a 60-something woman whose expression suggested perpetual dissatisfaction. Her designer luggage, flashy jewelry, and meticulous styling broadcast wealth, but her frequent sighs and eye-rolling communicated impatience with the world's failure to acknowledge her importance. Her gaze swept across the waiting area with proprietary disdain, landing repeatedly on Washington with growing irritation. "Ridiculous," Whitfield muttered just loudly enough to be heard by those nearest her. "They'll let anyone in first class these days." Her companion, a thin man whose demeanor suggested long practice in placating her moods, nodded automatically. "The standards have completely collapsed," she continued, her voice rising strategically. "I remember when people dressed properly for travel and knew their place." Several passengers shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Washington didn't look up from her documents, either not hearing the comments or choosing not to acknowledge them. Whitfield's lips tightened, her annoyance growing at being so thoroughly ignored. The seeds of confrontation had been planted, awaiting only the right moment to bloom into something uglier. Dolores Whitfield was not accustomed to being disregarded. Her wealth had purchased decades of deference, and Washington's composed indifference to her existence was an affront she couldn't tolerate. With a decisive huff, she abandoned her place in line and marched to the gate agent's podium, her heels striking the floor like punctuation marks. "Excuse me," she said, voice honeyed with false politeness. "I need to speak with you about a security concern." The young gate agent looked up, surprised by the interruption of her pre-boarding preparations. Whitfield leaned closer, lowering her voice to a theatrical whisper that carried perfectly. "That woman over there," she tilted her head toward Washington, "has been behaving very strangely, watching everyone, especially watching bags. I've noticed her eyeing my jewelry for 20 minutes now." The gate agent's forehead creased with confusion. "Ma'am, I haven't observed any—" "Well, of course you haven't," Whitfield interrupted. "You're busy, but I know suspicious behavior when I see it." Her voice hardened. "And I find it very unlikely she belongs in first class. Has anyone verified her ticket is legitimate? Because I've been flying this route for 15 years, and I know who belongs." The coded language hung in the air, its meaning unmistakable. The gate agent looked increasingly uncomfortable, caught between customer service protocols and the ugly insinuation. "All passengers are verified before—" "Call security," Whitfield insisted. "I don't feel safe, and neither should you." The commotion drew the attention of 2 airport security officers patrolling nearby. Officer Vance Mercer, a veteran with 18 years of experience and a disciplinary file as thick as a law textbook, approached with his younger partner, Officer Damon Wells, following close behind. Whitfield pivoted immediately, her expression transforming from demanding to distressed. "Officers, thank goodness," she breathed, bringing a manicured hand to her throat. "That woman," she pointed directly at Washington, "has been watching everyone's belongings, especially mine. She keeps looking at me strangely. I'm certain she doesn't belong in first class, and I'm concerned about what she might do on the flight." Mercer's gaze swept toward Washington, his expression already hardening with presumption. "We'll handle this, ma'am," he assured Whitfield. "Just step back and let us do our job." Officer Mercer moved toward Washington with practiced intimidation, his partner flanking him like they were approaching an armed suspect rather than a woman reviewing documents. Passengers parted instinctively, creating a corridor of uncomfortable silence. Some averted their eyes, while others watched with the uncomfortable fascination of those witnessing a crash in progress. "Ma'am," Mercer began, his voice calibrated to convey authority while technically remaining professional, "I need you to step aside for questioning." Washington looked up calmly, taking in the situation with a single glance. She noted Whitfield standing back with poorly concealed satisfaction, the nervous gate agent, and the 2 officers presenting a unified front. She placed her tablet in her bag and stepped aside as requested. "How can I help you, officer?" she asked, her voice level and controlled. "We've received reports of suspicious behavior," Mercer stated, his tone suggesting the matter was already decided. "I'll need to see your ID and boarding pass immediately." Washington retrieved her passport and boarding pass, handing them over without comment. "May I ask what specific behavior prompted this intervention?" she inquired. Mercer's jaw tightened at the question. "When an officer asks for documentation, the appropriate response is compliance, not questions." His eyes scanned her credentials with obvious skepticism, lingering on her first-class ticket. "Justice Washington," he read aloud, his tone suggesting disbelief. And what exactly do you do that puts you in first class? I serve on the federal judiciary, she replied simply. Wells, the younger officer, shifted uncomfortably, but Mercer's expression hardened further. Right, he said, dragging the word out. And I'm the Secretary of Defense. Let's try again. What's your real occupation? Washington's expression remained impassive, but her eyes hardened. Officer Mercer, I've provided my identification and answered your question truthfully. Your tone and insinuations constitute harassment, not security. You're questioning my authority? Mercer's voice rose sharply. That's exactly the kind of attitude that raises red flags. I'm asserting my rights as a citizen, Washington replied. Your conduct is inappropriate and potentially discriminatory. That's it, Mercer snapped, hand moving to his handcuffs. Anyone who plays the discrimination card is hiding something. Wells shifted nervously. Vance, maybe we should... I know how to handle these situations, Mercer cut him off. Ma'am, put your hands behind your back. You're being detained for interfering with security operations and disorderly conduct. This is an unlawful detention, Washington stated calmly, her eyes sweeping the growing crowd of witnesses, and everyone here knows it. Dolores Whitfield watched the unfolding scene with undisguised satisfaction, arms crossed over her designer blouse, a slight smile playing at the corner of her lips. She had accomplished exactly what she'd intended, putting this woman in her place through the proxy of authority. The fact that the officers had so eagerly taken her bait only confirmed her worldview, that her word would always carry more weight than someone like Washington. Washington maintained her composure despite the public spectacle Mercer was creating. Years on the bench had taught her the value of emotional regulation, even as anger and indignation burned beneath her calm exterior. She took a measured breath, aware that her response now would matter not only for her immediate safety, but potentially for case law that might follow. Officer Mercer, she stated firmly, I will comply under protest, but I want the record to be absolutely clear that this detention is without probable cause, without reasonable suspicion, and appears motivated by racial bias rather than legitimate security concerns. I am formally requesting your badge number and your supervisor's immediate presence. Mercer's face flushed with rage at the challenge to his authority. Turn around and place your hands behind your back, he ordered, voice raised to ensure everyone nearby could hear. You're being detained for uncooperative behavior, potential security threats, and disorderly conduct. Your attitude is all the reasonable suspicion I need. The gate area had gone completely silent. The normal airport bustle suspended as passengers watched the confrontation with horrified fascination. Phones appeared discreetly, recording the incident from multiple angles. The gate agent had stepped back, seemingly torn between intervention and self-preservation, finally reaching for a phone to call a supervisor. Wells, the younger officer, shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing as Mercer roughly took Washington's wrist, spinning her around with unnecessary force before securing the handcuffs with a definitive click. The metal bit into her skin, tightened beyond what procedure dictated, a small, vindictive gesture of power. Is this really necessary? An older gentleman in the boarding line finally spoke up. She hasn't done anything wrong. Sir, step back or you'll be next, Mercer snapped without looking away from Washington. This is a security matter. Washington winced slightly as the cuffs dug into her wrists, but kept her voice measured. I want everyone present to note that I am complying fully while maintaining that this detention is unlawful and discriminatory. I have not resisted in any way. Save it for someone who cares, Mercer replied, gripping her upper arm tightly. Let's go. We have some questions that need answering at the security office. Whitfield stepped forward, unable to resist adding her voice now that victory seemed secure. "I knew she didn't belong here," she announced loudly. "Thank you, officers, for keeping us safe from these people." The naked prejudice in the statement caused several passengers to look at Whitfield with disgust, but she remained oblivious, basking in what she perceived as vindication. Washington was marched through the terminal like a criminal, head held high despite the handcuffs binding her wrists behind her back. The busy concourse parted before them, travelers stopping to stare at the unusual sight of a professionally dressed black woman being led away by security. Some looked away uncomfortably, others openly recorded the procession on their phones. The walk seemed interminable. Through the main terminal, past shops and restaurants where diners paused mid-bite to watch, down service corridors where airport employees stared in confusion. With each step, Washington cataloged faces, comments, reactions, evidence for what would come later. She noted the exact time on wall clocks, the locations of security cameras, the names on employee badges they passed. Her judicial mind never stopped working, even as her shoulders ached from the unnatural position of her restrained arms. Officer Wells maintained an uncomfortable silence throughout the walk, his earlier hesitation hardening into complicity through inaction. Mercer, by contrast, seemed energized by the situation, occasionally pulling Washington's arm with unnecessary force when she didn't turn quickly enough or move fast enough to suit him. "Almost there," he announced as they approached a nondescript door marked "Airport Security. Authorized personnel only. Then we can get to the bottom of who you really are and what you're up to." Washington said nothing, conserving her energy and maintaining her dignity. She had spent decades studying the law, applying it fairly, and trusting in its power. Now, ironically, she found herself victim to its misapplication. But she also knew that true justice, while sometimes delayed, would not be denied. The system that she had served faithfully for years was about to be tested in a very personal way. The airport security office was deliberately austere. Fluorescent lighting, utilitarian furniture, and walls the color of faded manila folders. It was designed to intimidate through institutional sterility, a space where power dynamics were clearly established and reinforced. At a metal desk in the center of the room sat Sergeant Patel, the intake officer responsible for processing detainees. Mercer pushed Washington forward with unnecessary force. "Got someone who needs an attitude adjustment, Sarge, causing trouble at gate C-37, questioning officers, generally being uncooperative." Sergeant Patel looked up from his computer, his expression carefully neutral. "Name and ID?" "Claims she's some big-shot judge," Mercer said with a dismissive snort. "Got a fancy passport and a first-class ticket, but something's not right." Washington stood silently as Officer Wells placed her passport and boarding pass on the desk. The sergeant opened the passport and began entering information into his computer. His fingers moved methodically over the keyboard, the routine process of logging another detention. "Full name?" Sergeant Patel asked, looking directly at Washington for the first time. "Imani Rebecca Washington," she replied calmly. "Date of birth? March 17th, 1972. Current address?" She provided it quietly but clearly. "Occupation?" Patel asked, the question a standard part of the intake process. Mercer leaned against the wall, arms crossed, smirking in anticipation of whatever implausible story this woman would invent to justify her first-class ticket and air of authority. "I am the Chief Justice of the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit," Washington stated, her voice neither raised nor apologetic, simply factual. Sergeant Patel's fingers froze above the keyboard. His eyes darted from Washington's face to his computer screen and back again. The silence in the room suddenly felt dense, pressurized. "I'll need verification of that," he said carefully, typing rapidly. "My credentials are in my handbag," Washington replied, "which Officer Mercer currently has in his possession." All eyes turned to Mercer, who had pushed himself away from the wall, his expression shifting from smugness to uncertainty. "Check the bag," Sergeant Patel ordered, his voice tight. Wells quickly retrieved the handbag and placed it on the desk. Sergeant Patel opened it carefully, extracting a leather wallet that he flipped open to reveal a federal judicial identification card with the seal of the United States courts. His face drained of color. "Chief Justice Washington," he said, standing immediately. There appears to be a serious misunderstanding." Mercer's face had gone ashen, the full implications of his actions beginning to register. Wells looked physically ill, eyes darting toward the exit as if calculating escape routes. "Indeed," Washington agreed calmly. "A misunderstanding that began with racial profiling, escalated to unlawful detention, and has now resulted in the false arrest of a federal judge. I believe that summarizes our situation accurately. Now, I'd appreciate having these handcuffs removed immediately." Officer Mercer stood paralyzed, his body rigid with shock as reality crashed down around him. 18 years of police work, reduced to ashes in 15 minutes of catastrophic judgment. His mind raced through the implications: administrative leave, internal affairs investigation, possible criminal charges, media firestorm, the end of his career, and potentially his freedom. "The cuffs, Officer Mercer," Sergeant Patel repeated sharply when Mercer failed to move. "Remove them now." Mercer stumbled forward, fumbling with his keys, his fingers suddenly clumsy with dread. When he finally unlocked the restraints, Washington brought her hands forward slowly, rubbing her wrists where angry red marks testified to the excessive tightness of the cuffs. "Chief Justice Washington," Mercer began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I had no idea there was a complaint. We were just following protocol." "On your knees," Wells suddenly blurted out, dropping to the floor himself. "Please, Your Honor, I have a family. A baby daughter. I was just following my senior officer's lead. I never would have, if I had known. Please don't ruin our lives." The spectacle of the two officers, one kneeling in desperate supplication, the other frozen in horror, might have been satisfying to someone who sought vengeance. Washington was not such a person. Justice, not revenge, had been her life's work. "Stand up, Officer Wells," she said quietly. "Your posture does nothing to address what happened here today." Her calm only intensified their panic. Mercer finally found his voice, words tumbling out in desperate justification. "That woman at the gate, she said you were suspicious, watching bags, casing the area. We had to respond to the complaint. It's procedure. And did procedure dictate assuming my guilt rather than verifying facts?" Washington asked. "Did it require public humiliation rather than discreet inquiry? Did it call for excessive force against a cooperative subject?" Neither officer could meet her gaze. Washington turned to Sergeant Patel. "I require 3 things immediately. First, contact Airport Authority Director Nathaniel Ramos. We served together on the Federal Law Enforcement Training Commission. Second, call the U.S. Marshals Service and inform them of the situation. Third, ensure all security footage is preserved, along with body camera recordings and witness statements." Patel nodded vigorously, already reaching for the phone. "Right away, Your Honor." "And locate the woman who made the false report," Washington added. "Dolores Whitfield, I believe was her name. She should not board her flight until this matter is addressed. The speed with which her orders were obeyed demonstrated how completely the power dynamic had reversed. The same authority that had been dismissively questioned 30 minutes earlier now commanded instant compliance. Mercer slumped into a chair, head in his hands. "My career is over," he muttered. "Your career," Washington replied evenly, "is the least of what's at stake here. This incident represents a fundamental breakdown in the equal application of law, the very foundation of the justice system I've sworn to uphold. The consequences will reflect that gravity." The room fell silent except for Sergeant Patel's urgent phone conversation, arranging for senior officials to come immediately to the security office. The security office transformed within 20 minutes from a place of police dominance to the epicenter of an institutional crisis. Airport Authority Director Nathaniel Ramos arrived first, his face ashen when he recognized Washington. They had indeed served on multiple federal committees together. Close behind came the Chief of Airport Police, the TSA Regional Director, and two grim-faced U.S. Marshals whose primary duty was the protection of federal judges. "Imani," Ramos said, formality abandoned in the gravity of the moment. "I cannot begin to express—" "Nathaniel," Washington interrupted gently, "the time for apologies will come. For now, we need facts and action." The efficiency with which the high-ranking officials took control was remarkable. Officers Mercer and Wells were separated and taken to different rooms for formal statements. Sergeant Patel compiled all documentation related to the detention. The security footage was retrieved and displayed on monitors in the office, the damning sequence playing out in high definition. Whitfield's approach to the gate agent, the officer's aggressive intervention, Washington's dignified compliance, the unnecessary force, the public humiliation. "Jesus Christ," muttered the Chief of Airport Police, watching Mercer tighten the handcuffs beyond protocol. "This is indefensible." "Ms. Whitfield has been located," announced an assistant, entering the room. "She was already in her seat on the aircraft. We've removed her from the flight pending questioning." Washington nodded. "Ensure she understands the seriousness of filing a false report that resulted in unlawful detention. I want her full statement on record." As if summoned by the mention of legal consequences, the airport's legal counsel entered the room, followed by a representative from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division who happened to be traveling through O'Hare and was hastily recruited given the high-profile nature of the detainee. "Chief Justice Washington," the DOJ attorney began, "this incident clearly raises concerns under multiple federal statutes, including potential violations of 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. Would you like us to open a formal investigation?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Washington. Her decision in this moment would determine careers, criminal charges, potentially years of legal proceedings. The power to destroy lives rested entirely in her hands, a familiar weight for any judge, but rarely so personal. "Yes," she said simply, "the law must apply equally to those who enforce it. Open the investigation." Officer Wells, being escorted back to the main office, heard her words and visibly crumpled. Officer Mercer, in a separate room, remained unaware that his worst fears were being confirmed. Dolores Whitfield was brought into the office area, her earlier arrogance replaced by confused indignation that quickly transformed into horror as she realized exactly who she had targeted and the storm she had unleashed. The federal investigation proceeded with uncharacteristic speed, driven by the high-profile nature of the victim and the irrefutable evidence. Within 3 months, the Department of Justice presented its findings and recommendations. Officer Vance Mercer was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal civil rights violation carrying up to 10 years imprisonment. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Body camera footage, security videos, multiple witness statements, and Washington's own testimony. Facing a near-certain conviction, Mercer accepted a plea agreement. 2 years in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release, and permanent disqualification from law enforcement positions anywhere in the United States. Officer Damon Wells, deemed less culpable due to his junior status and limited participation, received a different outcome. He accepted a plea agreement involving no prison time but included 5 years of probation, 1,000 hours of community service, specifically in minority communities, and permanent disqualification from armed law enforcement roles. His cooperation in testifying against Mercer factored heavily in this more lenient arrangement. Sergeant Patel received a formal reprimand for failing to immediately question the detention when it occurred. But his prompt actions, once he recognized Washington's identity, mitigated more severe consequences. He was reassigned to administrative duties and required to complete advanced training in civil rights and implicit bias. The most surprising outcome involved Dolores Whitfield. Initially dismissive of the severity of her actions, her attitude changed dramatically when served with both criminal charges for filing a false report and a civil lawsuit from Washington for defamation, emotional distress, and violation of civil rights. Whitfield's attorneys quickly sought a settlement. The terms Washington proposed were unexpected. Rather than monetary damages, she required Whitfield to fund a new $2 million scholarship at Howard University School of Law specifically for students committed to civil rights litigation. Additionally, Whitfield would perform 500 hours of community service in predominantly black neighborhoods and undergo intensive education on the history of racial discrimination in America. In exchange, Washington would not oppose the reduction of criminal charges to a misdemeanor. Money is too easy, Washington explained when questioned about the unusual settlement. Writing a check requires no growth, provides no education, and creates no lasting change. The terms I've outlined demand something far more valuable: time, engagement, and the opportunity for transformation. The airport implemented comprehensive reforms and security protocols, including mandatory body cameras with automatic uploading, civilian oversight of detention decisions, and enhanced training on implicit bias. A new rapid verification process was established for checking credentials when professionals identified themselves, designed to prevent similar incidents. Throughout the proceedings, Washington maintained her judicial duties, authoring several significant opinions, including, ironically, a precedent-setting ruling on police immunity that legal scholars would debate for years. She neither sought publicity for the incident nor shied away from discussing it when asked, viewing it as an unfortunate but important teaching moment for the legal system she had devoted her life to improving. The case became required reading in law enforcement academies nationwide, a stark reminder that authority exercised without judgment, restraint, and equal application is not justice, but its perversion. 1 year after the incident, Chief Justice Imani Washington delivered the commencement address at Georgetown Law Center. Among the graduates sat the daughter of a family friend, but Washington's message extended far beyond personal connection. The great hall fell silent as she approached the podium, her reputation both as a brilliant jurist and as the unwilling center of a national conversation on race and justice having preceded her. "The law," she began, "exists in 2 realms simultaneously. In textbooks and courtrooms, it is a system of rules and procedures carefully refined over centuries, but in airport terminals, on street corners, during traffic stops, this is where citizens actually experience the law. The distance between these two realms represents our greatest challenge as a legal society. She spoke without notes, drawing from personal experience without directly referencing the incident that had placed her at the intersection of law's theory and practice. Justice isn't merely the correct verdict after a violation has occurred, she continued. True justice would have been the absence of violation altogether. The officer who recognizes his bias before acting on it, the bystander who intervenes rather than records, the system that prevents rather than merely punishes. In the audience, unnoticed by most, sat former Officer Damon Wells, attending as part of his community service requirement. His expression reflected not resentment, but something closer to awakening. We cannot legislate the human heart, Washington concluded, but we can demand that actions reflect our highest principles rather than our basest instincts. The gap between law as written and law as experienced must be bridged, not just by those with robes and gavels, but by every person who claims to value justice,